Well, hi.
Hi,
To start off, would you like to just say your name and where in the world you are right now?
I'm Mark Fairfield, and at the moment I'm in the Berkshires in Western Massachusetts, in the US.
Hmm, okay. And the first question is a pretty big one. It's a little open, but it's kind of fun. It's who are you as a human being? And I
Hmm,
mean, that can be values or passions or qualities about yourself, whatever comes to mind.
Yeah, you're right. It's a really big question. Um, and my impulse is to go with sort of values, as the most orienting way to respond. But so I'll say that, but I'll throw in some other things too. I definitely um, am someone, who is very sensitive. Um, I really react to the experiences that I'm undergoing. I'm very sort of tuned in to my environment, and I I kind of act up or speak out, when I feel um, something is an inequity or an injustice or causing distress for myself or the people that I'm around, and uh, and that's a lot to carry around. I think maybe some people might say I'm a highly sensitive person, kind of based on that more sort of recent body of research about sort of correlations, between this kind of sensitivity and certain, life experiences that we can predict. And I think it's had a huge um, impact on most of my choices, including my choice to be an activist and to um, to care about um, what kind of culture really takes into account the kinds of things that can cause people suffering and distress. um, and what if we did a better job of building a whole environment so that it was deeply inclusive of our neurodiversity, our cultural diversity, our physical diversity, all of that stuff. um, and uh, I think also because I'm a highly sensitive person, I really love pleasure. I think it's actually really important to justice. I think I think when we try and achieve something like coexisting or tolerance, that we're really missing the mark. There's something about
Yeah.
enjoyment and engagement and sensuality that keeps us kind of really engaged and caring about how we're kind of co-navigating this world. So yeah, maybe that's the best way to answer the question. I'm
Hmm.
someone who's deeply, concerned about issues of equity and justice, and I'm also someone who loves play and pleasure um, and connecting, with community.
So another question would be, what comes to mind for you now, specifically as an event or a particular set of circumstances in your life that you would say shaped you to become this person that you're describing right now?
Yeah. Um, well, so um, I my family was an immigrant family, Sicilian immigrants, um, and um, so I was kind of raised very much in Sicilian culture as a counterculture to the dominant culture in the U.S. Grew up in Southern California, but felt very much like actually I grew up in a small village in Sicily,
Okay.
because that's just kind of how my grandmother, um, how she succeeded really in kind of organizing us to care about her values. And but I grew up I was born in the late 60s, so I was kind of coming up in the 70s and early 80s, and I'm gay, and I I was Catholic, and got put in a oddly, got enrolled in a fundamentalist evangelical Christian school, and so there was for 13 years. So there was actually a lot about my first couple decades of life that really agitated me about
Hmm.
belonging and a lack of belonging, and the risks when people don't claim you as their own, and sort of this whole experience of where do I belong, and is that good? Is that going to be good for me? Those were always questions, that were the center of my mind. And so one of the things I guess I would say is that kind of there is some profoundly organizing reality about kind of waking up and discovering you're queer, but you're stuck in environments where there isn't even such a thing as queer. There's not even language to
Yeah.
talk about it, and certainly demonstrating it in any way would be unsafe. And so despite having this really deep sense of belonging to kind of my native culture and my tight, communal collectivist Sicilian family, I knew I didn't belong there. I didn't feel safe there. And something was happening to me that just forced me to have to deconstruct, the terms of belonging. And that really propelled me, I think, on my journey of kind of exploring what are the conditions, that make it possible for humans to claim each other as kind of
Hmm.
members of a shared community, which is clearly something that I always dreamed about, in large part because I I felt on the outside of the human community, for so much of my early life in particular.
And so what are some of those conditions? Like what is it that you create in the spaces and the communities that you build?
Mm, yeah, it's a great question. I mean, the biggest one for me has been um, the importance of a kind of um, mainstream cultural practice of mutual attunement, that tuning into each other on a regular basis and sort of being able to hear, tell me something about the context that you're coming out of in this moment. If it's
Hmm.
if we do a daily check-in, then it's like, what happened today? It's important for me and all of us to know, so that we can include, worries, frustrations, needs that you're afraid won't get met. Literally, like, how do we stay tuned into each other, sort of to grease the wheels, so that when we have to collaborate, when we have to make decisions quickly on our feet, when and hoping that those decisions end up actually being deeply, meaningfully representative of what everybody has weighed in that they need, right? Um, that basically we include each other meaningfully when our whole structure and embodiment adjusts to make room for the new thing that wasn't there before. And I know that's a lot to ask people. That's kind of setting a really high bar. Like, to really include, you'll change, but
Yeah, I mean,
that's what I've
it
learned.
imagines a lot of tolerance for that deconstructing process
Yeah.
to sort of
Well,
put yourself back together in a new shape. That's
and in it, and not just put yourself back together, but be put back together by a we, which I think a lot of us can feel really uncomfortable about, because it doesn't feel quite the same as a more sort of considered, measured, controlled decision about who I'm going to be today and what's my story today. So it's definitely more vulnerable. But I have found that the risks of that vulnerability are far outweighed by the benefits of the quality of inclusion that comes as a result.
I mean, for Gestalt, I mean, the risk is becoming fixed, right? So there we go.
This is
So
true.
when you talk about this co-creation, I'm interested, who comes up for you as another human being who has really influenced you or had an impact?
Yeah. Yeah, thanks for asking that. Well, I've got a deep connection to what I kind of think of as my co-conspirators in this kind of building a relational culture sort of obsession. My colleagues, Lucien Damaris and Cedar Landsman, who are not unknown in Gestalt circles, but potentially aren't known as well as they ought to be, given actually how influenced I have felt by the collaborating that we've done now together for over a decade. Yeah, but I think of others as well who are a little bit more sort of far-flung and, living in other places around the world that have become also special to me in my journey as a Gestalt trainer and writer and teacher.
Did you want to say anything about them or no?
Well, sure. I just didn't know. Was there going to be a follow-up question?
Well, this is just a
Those
tease,
people?
right?
I know, right? No, maybe I'm having a little fun. I'm not sure, but so I want to say I think I was as many Gestaltists have been, deeply influenced by learning from Lynn Jacobs, who was a mentor of mine. She still is. I still consider her to be a mentor of mine. And in particular, the way that I felt kind of inspired, agitated, challenged by her to keep pushing the envelope of what it means to really achieve those relational values. My interest always took me to thinking about that at higher levels of scale than the scenarios where Lynn is known for her body of work and her teaching, which is much more sort of focused on that kind of one-to-one clinical intervention. And so it made sense that I would also gravitate towards, people who were inspiring me to move into larger spaces, to move a little bit more in the direction of preventing rather than intervening in problems. So, really big one is Gordon Wheeler, whose deconstruction of individualism was so kind of crucial to keeping that inspiration alive for me. And Lynn did a really great job of making sure I had a good, strong bridge to Gordon pretty early on. And Gordon's become another really powerful influence and nurturing mentor in my life. And then there's just the community of colleagues and friends and extended family who kind of got into some trenches with me back in the day when we were, doing a lot of experimenting in the UK that was Sally Denham-Vaughan, and her partner Marianne Chidiac. We've done some inspiring stuff together, and I have felt well accompanied by them in this kind of vision of thinking about inclusive community in Australia. Leanne O'Shea, as well as Ashley Power and Patty O'Regan, who have consistently brought me to Australia practically every year when there wasn't a pandemic preventing it, for about a decade and a half. And then here in the US, the organizational folks who've been also a deep inspiration for this kind of passion for keep continuing to push that envelope. Bob Kolodny, Kathy Carlson, and Marianne Krause in Cleveland. So these are the people I kind of hold as, yeah, they'll keep me honest. Maybe they'll hold me accountable to my values, my professed values. They'll let me know when I haven't hit the target, when I'm upset or hurt. They'll be there to comfort me when I've been down and out. They've built bridges for me. These are, deeply important members of my community, and they are all connected to the Gestalt world. Yeah.
And I mean, that's impressive, like that restructuring of a community where you seem to have found a spot for yourself and are not too much and are not, outside.
Yeah.
That's remarkable.
Yeah. Thank you. Thank you.
So a little bit more about yourself. I am wondering, you mentioned, sort of when you were born. So how are you experiencing your age and the aging process?
Such a great question. Interestingly, I just turned 53. I think I was born 32 and have always been 32. Like that's what's weird, is like in my story of myself, that's the age I'm sort of stuck in.
Okay.
And so to the degree that what looks like 53 doesn't quite match up with what looked like 32, it's disorienting. Like, hang on, what's happening here? On the other hand, for much of my life, people have always mistaken me for being much younger than I actually am. So I don't know, I guess I'm looking for maybe to getting a little more respect, as I start looking like
it's true.
in
It's
his
true.
50s, The other thing I'll say is that, my 40s were one of the most prolific periods of my life. I did a lot. I look back on, just like computer files of stuff, that, I'm just like documents.
Just the volume
and,
of
yes,
email.
and the file directories and stuff. And just thought, you were crazy. Who were you? What were you doing? I just was on fire, and I had a lot of energy. I didn't sleep very much, and I just really went and went and went. And a lot of it was, regardless of whether there were resources to support me doing it. It was just, I refused to be, kind of limited by a lack of resources. But of course that catches up with you eventually, because you compensate for the lack of resources with harder labor, longer hours, more determination. I'm sure also probably a lot of things that made me, difficult to sensitize to other issues, right? Because I was very kind of, single-minded in a lot of my pursuits. But what I've noticed is that in my 50s, I'm getting a lot of opportunity to actually have the impact that I had hoped I would have in my 40s. And I want to go on record as saying it really wasn't ultimately just the result of being very, very hardworking and refusing to say no, and, trying to agitate the world about, that the house is on fire, which is all stuff I've done. But ultimately, the opportunity that I'm having in my 50s is such a direct result of relationships, with people um, uh, who who want, there to be this ongoing collaboration, and understand that that requires us, syncing up and offering each other support and making sure the resources are there. And I'm just recognizing that that's the right pace at this
Mhm.
point in my life, because I don't have the same appetite. I don't want to spend every waking hour thinking about these things the way that I used to.
Mhm.
I want balance.
Mm.
Um, I feel like the work I'm devoted to doing is the long game. And as a long game, it doesn't really make a lot of sense to work yourself into the ground and
No.
lose your staying power. Like, it has to be sustainable, and it has to take into account that I'm aging, and that I'm going to become increasingly more limited. So I'm welcoming at 53 a more strategic focus on how to use the time
Mm.
with a lot more potential impact, um, but moderation of work and effort, and making sure I'm also spending my time and my energy on cultivating the sensual pleasures of connection, and
Nice.
building infrastructure for community. I like to think about the home that we're creating, for example, as a kind of relational refuge, as a place, um, where we all feel included, and where others will hopefully help us include them,
Mm.
which I'm sure we'll have to learn how to do, right? Because it's not easy to do that. Yeah. Mm.
Mm. Okay. So, another aspect of yourself that I'm interested in is how you experience and understand yourself in terms of gender or as a man.
Another great question. Listen, gender has been the single most confounding phenomenon that I have experienced in my life. I am terrified by it. I knew from a very early age that I was going to fail at performing whatever the expectations were with regard to gender. I mean, I was terrified, and that was a huge part, actually, of what got me kind of feeling like I don't know how to belong. If they make me act like that, I might have to kill myself. I just don't know how to do it. There's like a whole thing. There's a whole performance. It's somatic. It's cognitive. It's I don't know what it is. I've never been able to actually study it well enough to replicate it, but I can notice it, and
And
uh,
just know that that was not going
it's
to
not
come out of
me.
you.
It's
Yeah.
never going to come out of me. I didn't know what was going to come out of me. So understandably, I just haven't found the construct particularly useful. Like, as a construct, I'm not
Hmm.
really quite sure what I'm achieving, if I find how to slot myself into that. So
Hmm.
of course I relate to the kind of non-binary and fluid, deconstruction of that
Yeah.
fixed gender stereotype. Um, but I'm also 53. And so, like, there, at the time when I was having to kind of help people identify me on that spectrum, there weren't a lot of other options, you know. And as I said, there wasn't even like gay male. There was just boy and girl, or man and woman. And so I think probably at a certain point, I just got comfortable with, I'll just be a boy. It's about the closest that I can. It's still not right.
Mhm.
I've been through this for hundreds of hours. There isn't a word, just hasn't been invented. But that being how I feel, that being my kind of phenomenal experience, I'm also aware that people will look at this body and probably say, well, that's a man. And all of the stories that may generate for them based on how they relate to that construct becomes something that I may have to wear,
Yeah,
even
you end
though
up
it doesn't
carrying
fit.
an
Yes.
external
Yeah.
masculinity.
Yeah. And then you end up, playing with that. It's like, well, look, if you're going to make me do that, then I'm going to have fun with it. Like I'm going to figure out how to make it feel pleasurable for me, because I've spent too many years of my life being terrified about, what it means that it doesn't line up with what other people expect of me. So, I really try and hold it very lightly. I have a lot of analysis and critique of gendering. I'm in deep relationships with other people who are sort of similarly positioned. I actually think it's a huge resource for this quest, for inclusion, that we have access to the subjectivity of humans who are, who are not able to perform, those categories. I do think it's a huge opportunity. It's been a huge opportunity for me. It's kind of propelled me into caring more about inclusion, which I think I see as a little bit of a trend of that, in thinking about the sort of queer communities and queer movements, and the way that positions people to color outside the lines, in a variety of other ways as well. I mean, there is just something so fundamental about the gender story, like the way that it's presented. It's like, if you're a human, you're either a male human or a female human. It's such a potent story, even though we have plenty of evidence that there's all kinds of things in between. But it's right up there with human. Well, if you're human, then you're, this. So it gets kind of positioned above culture in weird ways. And so if you don't, line up with that, and it's so fundamental, of course it scares the shit out of you, because you're like, well, how am I going to manage in this world? But
It's like freezing on the
it,
first question of a 200 question exam.
No, exactly. That's exactly right. And it's like, well, okay, I'm gonna have to step over onto this side. That's what's being asked of me. Or the bathroom situation, right, where you go and it's like, okay, what does the triangle mean as opposed to the stick figure? I literally have to pause and think, wait, now which one am I? It doesn't come naturally. And so when you think about that there's this basic fundamental way that you're already not buying into, the way your humanity is being storied, that's huge. And so I do think it's an opportunity, right? Because it gives you the impetus to be looking really critically, at a lot of the constructs, and wondering who else is being excluded, by them.
Yeah, and I think that's pretty much my next question, which I actually think is a lot of fun, which is how you experience and understand power and privilege in your life.
Yeah. Yeah. So, yeah, thank you for asking that question too. Um, I really want to answer this question. I'm just thinking about sort of the way in. You know, um, one of the things that makes me think about right off the top is that I mentioned that my family were immigrants. My grandfather was um, a oh, sorry, I suddenly forgot the word. You cut hair, barber.
Okay.
I mean, he had the electric clippers and the seat out in the garage. And my grandmother was a seamstress, and and mm, the man who raised me, my mother's partner, was a tool and die maker, right? So this blue collar, we're talking working class blue collar with some financial stability because of all of the advantages. I mean, think about at that time and in this country, there were some progressive programs and lots of tax credits that actually helped people like my parents to, achieve some stability. I mean, that's because we were white, or that's how people related to us as
Mhm.
white. And because he was really well paid. But I mean, at the end of the day, what that meant from where I was sitting was that I kind of thought about um, money and power to make decisions really in a way that I came to appreciate was quite different from people who would become my peers by the time I got to like graduate school,
Mhm.
which I was never supposed to go to. I mean, there
Okay.
was never a story, even that you would go to university. I mean, um, my stepfather was, only I think finished the eighth grade, and my mother graduated high school but had really no college, so it wasn't like a value. It's not like that's not a thing, that we do. And so it took mentors, mostly from high school, kind of recognizing, well, this guy has some contributions potentially to make. We should make sure that he has access to all the education that would help, right? And so I got a lot of support, even to just want to go to college. And
Mhm.
but anyway, I ended up, long story, hopefully shorter, now, is I did end up in a graduate program at Columbia University in New York City, in my 20s, in social work. And I didn't get that literally everybody else who was, sitting in those chairs, came from a professional class or higher already. I didn't even know what professional class was. I'd never used the words before. I didn't have that as a concept. So I just assumed, you know, I I wasn't sure whether I was going to be able to pay for my New York apartment from one month to the next, but I just assumed that would be everybody, right? Everybody's experience. So over time, I just started to get that the more I appeared to belong, which, I'm adaptable, I can be creative, I also know how to attune, and inclusion matters to me. So I know how to include, and I I I hope I can support people to include me. So I feel like people just thought I fitted in,
Mhm.
to kind of a that class. And I just always felt like, when are they going to find out that I
Oh,
do
the
not
imposter
belong
syndrome.
here?
Beautiful.
What was weird though about it was I I thought I deserved to be there,
Mhm.
um, but I didn't realize how much they were taking for granted that I couldn't take for granted until I started to just listen to how people talked about how they spent their time on the weekends and where they would travel to and what restaurants they would go to. And
The leisure privileges.
that's
Yes.
that's it exactly. Now that was a long time ago, and I've been a part of that class now for quite a while, though I did take a sort of 10-year hiatus from really cashing in on most of that. And that's when I had founded the Relational Center and was its executive director for 12 years. I you know, I intentionally refused to cash in on that privilege and tried to use whatever social capital I had built, to get people to pay attention to this project and really support it. It's, the curse of the nonprofit executive, where everything, all of your public profiles are, they're basically about promoting
Yeah.
your labor of love. Um, and I'm not unhappy that I made those choices at all. In some ways, I feel like it's given me a lot more of a sense of being choiceful. Like I have choices about
Mhm.
how to use that kind of privilege if I have it now.
Yeah.
But I don't take for granted that I'm going to have it. And I think that just comes from sort of that earlier experience of immigrant working class, um, and a lot of chaos, a lot of um, family chaos, and we just weren't like other people. We weren't like other kids' families. We always tried to fit in,
Mhm.
but there was always also this very direct connection to my grandparents came here, and as far as they're concerned, this is their new home, but this isn't where they came from. And I don't know, there's just something about that background condition that if people don't include it as part of my context, I always feel like they're missing something really important about me.
Yeah, it sounds sort of like people pushing you into a melting pot, and you and your people are not jumping into the melting pot.
Yeah, well, also just the way that like my sister died when she was 31.
Sorry.
She um, she lived in poverty. She didn't have access to healthcare, so she used emergency rooms, which was part of how she died because she didn't have adequate healthcare. She waited tables to make a living for most of it. So it's like, you know, uh, that's where I come from, and we had those kinds of tragedies because those were real vulnerabilities. Now, other people have it so much worse, obviously, and so I'm not raising this, to say, oh, poor us, we had this horrible time. I'm a little bit more just saying that it's an eerie thing to do this upwardly mobile, weird transition. And, you know, even though I said I thought I deserved to be wherever I ended up, that imposter like thing of, you know, where where do I really belong? I guess that's just been a pretty big theme for me. So in terms of class and money and privilege, I also feel a little bit like I'm a kind of a rogue. I go a little rogue with that. I really am interested in creating scenarios where people are living in commons, where they're sharing their resources, according to, equitably, according to their needs and their access. And 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 I'm really anxious not to wield the power that comes with being the guy that foots the bill, which I find grotesque and egregious. And it happens a lot, especially in the nonprofit industrial complex. So, which I'm sort of glad to have stepped outside of at this point. Yeah. So I just want to say, I'm aware that a lot of power is attributed to me. Some of it's, you know, inherited,
Yeah.
implicitly because of my skin color, and now, the kind of education that I was able to get. and that wasn't something I was deeply born into either.
Mhm.
And so it's actually been helpful in supporting me to always be interrogating what is my relationship to
Yeah, yeah.
power
I
and
mean, it,
privilege.
it, it sounds like recognizing the privilege, but without having that just born into sense of entitlement.
Yeah, I don't feel entitled actually at all to it. And I keep thinking it's going to go away any minute
Yeah.
now. So that says something.
Hmm, okay. Well, I do want to switch a little bit to the Gestalty part of you. How did you find Gestalt? How did you meet?
Yeah, that's great. It's interesting. In my late teens, I went to therapy because I kind of had a depression, as many of us have in our late teens. And my my therapist at the time was trained in psychodrama, and so there was a way that there was some aesthetic
Mhm.
to the work that she would engage me in doing. That when I first spotted Gestalt work, I could see some of the overlaps, right? And I think why psychodrama, like in a way, like why that particular feature. And it's the phenomenology. It's I've given this actually quite a lot of thought, and given
What
everything
am
I
I
just told
doing
you,
here? Yeah.
yeah, exactly. And so given what I've already shared about like um just being confronted with, wait, there are stories about me that don't match my experience, I got suspicious of those stories. And I really started to crave like experiences, and then eventually like whole environments where these experiences would happen routinely, right? Where people would listen to what you had to say about what you actually feel and experience and honor it, and then like agree to be your ally in holding that story as your truth. Well, that was huge for
It's
me,
pretty wild.
yeah, against the backdrop of what I had to contend with. And so I was sold, I became kind of a lifelong learner from at a very early age, really, to to keep pursuing the possibility of having that as a condition that is ongoing. And eventually I thought, you know accessible to everyone, especially
Mhm.
though to people who are marginalized by stories that don't match their experience. So so I uh but so I actually had a Gestalt therapist as my second year field instructor in social work school, which was when I did a year-long placement at St. Vincent's Hospital, which now no longer exists, but was, of course, right in the middle of Greenwich Village during the AIDS epidemic. And that's when I was in New York doing social work, my
Right.
social work program in the early 90s. Um, and uh, and so it was powerful, and she showed up in a way, that really again aligned with, she cares about what I'm actually experiencing. I mean, I was terrified. I was terrified when I was put in that. I asked for it. Well, I
Mhm.
asked for an AIDS placement, and I don't know, I think I thought it'll be some outpatient gig, and instead they put me on an AIDS dedicated unit
Oh,
in a hospital which was, at the epicenter of the epidemic in the States. And um, and the inpatient dedicated unit was for those AIDS patients who had been hospitalized so many times that they were now considered the frequent flyers who needed the highest level of care, which basically meant they were the sickest,
yeah.
and many of them were going to leave through the morgue, and not with a family or friend, family member or friend to take them home. So it was really a lot about death and dying work and stuff. So you can imagine I was terrified of like, do I belong here? Do I have anything to contribute here? What could they possibly need from me, like that was, even though I was there, like feeling like I'm in solidarity, these are my people, this is my community. And Patty Whalen is the name of who my field instructor is. I want to name her because I'm really grateful for the way that Patty kept me, in a way, bridged to Gestalt by keeping close to me and accompanying me through some pretty scary, but ultimately amazing, learning experiences in that position. And it made an impression. And so anyway, I moved back to Los Angeles after about 5 years in New York. And I was already thinking, maybe I should get Gestalt training, because I've had these, really positive experiences. And so I don't know, I looked up the Gestalt Therapy Institute of Los Angeles, which used to be the name of the one training center before they diversified.
That's a good word.
I thought so. And I actually, funnily enough, later became the president of the GTILA and sort of helped run their continuing education stuff for several years. But the person who picked up the phone when I called that number turned out to be Jan Ruckert, who became really just a very dear friend of mine. Jan passed away a couple of years ago. I miss her. But she just plugged me in, and then suddenly I was going to a therapist group that Gary Yontif was running, and ended up doing a lot of good deep work with Gary as a result of that, and got to hear them talking about how they're forming these new institutes after the breakup, and so I went to study with Lynn and Gary as a result of that. And the faculty, eventually they were called PGI, right? Pacific Gestalt Institute. Actually had a temporary name for a year in between there, but it was it gave me some hope that maybe I had found a place, where I could belong, and I got a lot of support.
Yeah, the support I definitely hear. And my other question is, like, what did you find that made sense for you in Gestalt? What is it that you feel like you found your place?
Yeah, I think this is the very moment. So it's good timing, like in the course of that training experience, I was invested, like I felt like I was doing work that they felt was actually really important to be doing, and it pushed the envelope. It was a lot around group and community level interventions, a lot around harm reduction as an alternative to an abstinence only model, and working with substance youth, homeless youth. When I started writing, that's when I started kind of contributing to the literature, and I started writing stuff that was slightly edgy, because I was like trying to sort of say, hey, I love this whole system and this whole theory, and there's more to do, folks, because we haven't actually confronted some of the worst problems, actually. And I think a lot of that has to do with the fact that Gestalt therapy, unfortunately, got sort of channeled into being delivered through the market. And we all know that markets do not guarantee inclusion, not by any stretch of the imagination.
No, I would say they are exclusive. And actually, a lot of Gestalt trainings are marketed as exclusive retreats. And that's supposed to be attractive. I find it a little repulsive personally, but.
Sure. Yeah. Well, I mean, I guess it just depends on what you're after, and what you're needing from it. But what I was needing was, I was working at this place called Common Ground, which was basically it used to be the Santa Monica AIDS Project. So it's sort of on the west side of Los Angeles, the only kind of HIV services center. It was like, part of, teamed up with Venice Family Clinic, which is nationally kind of the largest, community-based family medical clinic in the country, and was helpful, oversaw, the partnership between those organizations. I was doing a lot of important stuff and wanting to be resourced, and wanting some sense of direction around, well, how do I approach this, as a gestaltist? Like, what am I bringing to this situation from that point of view? And inevitably, if you do that, especially with things where it's a little bit more blazing a trail or more at the cutting edge, what you inevitably end up doing is then critiquing Gestalt from the point of view of what's missing
Right.
when you're trying to confront these, big problems, which are always about, poverty and violence and, multiple diagnoses, right, of chronic illness, probably including HIV and multiple substance dependencies and homelessness. And like, there wasn't a training program that I was aware of, at the time, where anybody could have helped me think about what do we do with those problems?
No, I mean,
right?
generally the answer is we don't work with those clients.
Right. Which I couldn't have, that was not going to be me, right? So I think my interest in challenging us to sort of think about further developing the theory, was exciting to other faculty at PGI. And so it meant that I got a lot of support to try things and to experiment. And I mean, I feel really lucky about that. And it also meant that Lynn and Gary in particular, and Jan, all were like super invested in making sure that I got on faculty so that I could continue to make those contributions. So I have a lot of gratitude to those folks for having faith in me, because they really promoted my voice. They really created a platform for people to pay attention to the things that I was working on. I don't think I would have attracted that attention had it not been for that endorsement. I'm really clear about those things. So it's very important to me to acknowledge them.
I mean, it may be the difference of speaking from the inside versus speaking from the outside, right?
Yeah.
Interesting. So what would you say is the essence of your work? Not to be reductive, but I'm wondering what comes out.
So, I mean, there's in a way two different answers, right? Because there's the answer that assumes Gestalt is in the background, and then there's the answer that foregrounds Gestalt. Okay. So I'll answer both ways. So my calling, I don't know how else to think about it. To me, it doesn't feel like a nice thing. It feels like a really loud, alarm.
It's the phone you don't want to answer. Yeah.
And I can't turn it off, and that's how it's felt. I mean, and again, it felt more problematic to be hearing that alarm all the time in my 40s. Clearly, I've gotten more used to it, or others are sharing in the responsibility of signaling what I used to feel like I had to signal, alone most of the time. But ultimately, it's been rescuing relationship from basically a culture that holds it in suspicion, that invisibilizes its power and the resource that it brings for humans, for our resilience, for our success in collaborative ventures. And I think, again, I I feel gratitude to Lynn and Gordon for like helping me keep my focus on this problem. But
Mhm.
in America, you know, the urgent problem of rugged individualism in the way that it is now polarizing people to the point that we can't even be interested in understanding where one another is coming from. But beyond that, you know, just the way that uh, that big business, you know, has um, destroyed communities and families and habitats, many of which are far, far away from our notice, and and all really because, you know, we don't really have a shared standard that we'll all defend, you know, around what we'll tolerate losing for the sake of profit.
Mhm.
And I actually think that our humanity is at risk because of this. And so I've tried to figure out like systematically, like a bunch of different ways to wake people up to both the beautiful possibility and opportunity that exists in the relationships that they could have if they really worked on them and they really took that seriously, but also the imminent danger that we're in, you know, if we don't have those, if we can't take those relationships, those connections for granted, so, you know, especially when we have really big things that we have to change in the world, current moment being, you know, relevant to that. So I've just called it rescuing relationships, and I feel it's linked to my whole story, you know, including my Sicilian grandmother
Right.
and the culture that she wanted to protect. But what I also want to say is, I also come from that culture, that collectivist culture, and collectivism is also, you know, deeply problematic, particularly around diversity. It's a
Right.
really, really hard thing to contend with in a collectivist system. In fact, diversity is held in suspicion because it threatens to pull people's, you know, intention to be in solidarity apart. And so I feel like I straddle those two dilemmas all the time, just because of
Mhm.
the two big cultures that I always had to navigate. And it just positions me to be just kind of obsessed with, you know, oh, that's probably a phobic reaction to what appears to look like collectivism, which will send people all the way into rugged individualism because it's phobic. You know, like how can we, you know, depolarize this situation and,
Mhm.
you know, engage in conversations about how we belong and differentiate, right? Like how we have a secure sense of who we are as an us, and also how the us really values the varieties and the differences that we all bring, right? Like that's just always going to be a thing that
Mhm.
I'm going to be focused on. um, I think in Gestalt, what that has meant has been a couple of things. One is we need to go upstream. That's what I call it. Um, the both because it's being delivered in the market, and also because what that's meant is it's not funded work
Mhm.
unless it's marketable. As we know, in a country that doesn't have a socialized medicine, that basically means there's no incentive to fund activities that aren't that fee for service, right? Because that's how
Yeah.
people are making a living, right? So prevention efforts, which are generally far less costly, have no funding. You would, you know, you'd have to have a government that was pretty progressive to be allocating, you know, in the budget for programs that prevent people from getting sick. Essentially, it would be how do we produce health and well-being rather than how do we treat illness, right? And I actually think that's super aligned with kind of the founding thinkers in Gestalt. I think there was a pretty big critique of the social environment as menacing in our humanity. And I think that, the big story of the Gestalt movement was a lot about, let's wake up our animal, wake it up, it's gone to sleep, and without it, we don't even really know how to protect life. And how do we keep all of that online and continue this exquisite, attuning practice that humans are so uniquely positioned to take all the way to the bank? I mean, if we tried, if we could do it. And so for me, that all sort of points to, well, a lot of the work that Paul Goodman did. He was involved in designing curriculum, for youth education. He was involved with a sibling in designing an urban plan that created a built environment that actually organized people into this more social animal, scenario. I think they were all thinking pretty big. And I think that our thinking has been constrained by the delivery model. And the delivery model has forced us to go very far downstream when we could, at least some of us, be taking some excursions up to find out if there's anything we can do to prevent people from being in that stream in the first place.
Yeah.
And that just, I don't know who's gonna fund that work. So if we're doing that work as a living, I think that's going to be a problem. So what's been challenging from my point of
especially if
view,
you don't have that, background support and, trust fund to allow you to pursue your hobby, right?
Well, exactly. It then becomes a hobby. For me, I think it's become a calling, and it's obviously my activism, and I obviously have to make a lot of choices and spend my time in various ways that are not about earning money or making my living.
Right.
So I also have to do that, right? And I have to have enough access to that, but not for the whole time, so that I don't have then time to do this other stuff. So that's kind of been
the balance.
The labor of love for me in the Gestalt world is to retell the story of Gestalt, hopefully in a way that reminds people of the farthest reaching implications. I think particularly in this moment, Gestalt emerged during a very particular time in our social history where fascism was very much on the rise. And there's clearly more to be done about fascism. If we take a look at
it has not gone away. Yeah.
It is not. And in fact, it's kind of back, with a vengeance. And I want to pose the question, are we going to stay downstream at this point? Are we going to just keep doing this stuff where we're fishing people out of the waters already bruised and banged up and bleeding and broken? Or are we going to confront these big problems and assume that maybe there's something in the DNA of the Gestalt story that actually gives us a tool, a resource that the world needs, except they're never going to get it if we just keep delivering what we do in these very constrained ways. So that's the dilemma, I think.
Right. Yes. I identify with a lot of what you're saying. And I mean, just my personal experience is that I was not taught in my Gestalt training. There was sort of, as a systems thinker, I was an outsider to the individual therapy model that was being taught. No group was to be bigger than 12 people. And I'm like, how can I can't fit the communities and I can't fit the systems into a 12-person group. It doesn't work that way. But I think it is pretty fundamental to look at the larger levels and not just realize they exist and see how they impact on the individual, but it is a mindset and a skill set, and it may be a neurological set to be able to deal with those because they don't fit easily. It's a lot to take in. So
Yeah.
I really appreciate and
Mm,
admire the way you're able to articulate taking on those systems.
mm.
And I do want to ask
Thank you.
how all of this work, the challenges, the the fun parts, the pleasure, the relationships, how has Gestalt impacted you as a person?
Well, I mean, look, I think I think it rescued me from meaninglessness,
Hmm.
and I think it um, gave me hope, right, by giving me an image of what belonging might feel like, where I could bring more of myself. Um, I mean, Gestalt has invited me to um, to take up space with my point of view, which is a huge privilege, which I don't take lightly, which means it's made me an influential person in a much bigger pond than I probably would have been if I hadn't, joined the Gestalt community. And it's also really positioned me to it became the jumping off point for all of really my most kind of radical pursuits. And of course, it's changed my life by giving me a global community that I have deep relationships within, people that I consider really my family, that I love dearly, that I'm actually deeply missing at the moment because
Hmm.
the travel has been stopped and I don't know when I'm going to see them again.
Yeah.
Um, yeah, so I mean, it's done so much and it's also become a challenge. Like, like I feel dared by Gestalt to take Gestalt on, in a way that it even maybe more deeply embraces, its most radical potential. Um, yeah, so it's done a lot, actually.
Hmm. I mean, I'm just hearing this may be excessive on my part, but I just sort of hear you being in a system, questioning the system, jumping outside and making a new system instead of
Mm.
staying out there as some kind of defeated outsider,
Yes,
getting more and more bitter
yes,
about the first
yes,
system not
exactly.
working right.
Right.
It's
Yeah, I
interesting.
appreciate you
It's
saying that. I
constructive.
do. Yeah, well, that's also a really important word to me, right? Because we were talking about the deconstructive project, and of course, phenomenology, even field theory, there's a lot about, deconstructing. It's a deconstructive method, but what are we going to construct ultimately when everything else is pulled
Right.
down?
Yeah.
You know?
The constructive criticism. I mean,
Yeah, yeah.
critical thinking, critical theory is not about just taking things apart. It's
Well, hopefully, it's in the interest of finding ways to put it back together. That
exactly.
yeah, that address our concerns, right? So, but that's what I think about my work. Actually, I like that you use the word constructive. That it is about constructing alternative institutions, and the change strategy there is to first establish a culture that becomes the sandbox, where we have some consensually agreed upon definitions of harm and how to prevent them. And then everything else, in
Then you
as
can
long as
play.
it's not harming, yeah, then there's a lot of play. And what are the principles? What are the practices? What keeps us well organized based on our neurobiology, based on our evolutionary imperatives? Like, how do we make the most of those things and cultivate conditions for resilience and well-being and everybody leading in some way, right? Like, that's the most interesting question for me. And of course, you need a laboratory to do that in. Like, that's what's interesting.
The
And maybe,
experimental, creative kind of process, right?
yeah, that's right. And maybe your point about that you noticed that I'd gotten to have the experience of what it's like to stand outside a system. and notice, the harms that it can do and what the stakes are, for coming and going into those communities. Yeah, you could just withdraw and become alienated, or you could decide, well, actually, maybe this is the laboratory, because the truth is that no one seems to want to be out here. So maybe actually we can be
It's
creative
freedom.
about, yeah, we can just set up our rules out here and say, well, this is what we're going to do, and we don't belong. Yeah.
Interesting. So now my final question seems a lot of fun, which is to ask you what's next. What's
Mhm.
next for you, and what do you think? I mean, you've said Gestalt needs to go upstream. I don't know if there's
Mhm.
anything else you would say that could or should be next for it from your perspective.
Well, so I my my co-conspirators and I, Cedar, Lucien, and I are collaborating on a variety of projects, but mostly I've been kind of focusing on um, big change making organizations in this moment in time. There's a lot of agitation about diversity, equity, and inclusion, of course, with all that's going on, especially in our country. Um, and while that's not really been my brand, I'm not like the DEI expert by any stretch of the imagination, and I don't think that I'm the right, kind of representative for that at this moment either. I work with, friends and colleagues who are really deep in that work, in that space, and it's become kind of understood by a lot of people who are trying to do that work in organizations, that there's only so far you can get with transforming organizational culture before you bump up against how poor the quality of relationships are in the organizations. That there's just certain kinds of bridging across certain kinds of difference that are really impossible to do when people are suspicious of each other. And organizations literally wouldn't know what to do about actually directly trying to impact quality of relationships. It's just never, again, because they're not protected, they're not being rescued from, or culture in general,
Well, they're
including
not the
organizational
product,
cultures.
right? So
Exactly. So now they're trying to figure it out. How do we do it? And so that's become, it's like a little subspace within the DEI larger space of, let's help people find opportunities to appreciate one another's context, and then let that become the foundation for having these more complex conversations, which have been impossible to have, and therefore organizations continue to be at great risk of unraveling, because the people in them don't know how to stay together.
I like the word appreciating, because I mean, I can phenomenologically appreciate what's in front of me, but that doesn't mean it's just giving it blanket positivity.
Right.
It's a critical appreciation.
Yeah, well, absolutely. And it requires really listening, and it requires, if I put my feet in those shoes, why is it wise that this is what that person's, experiences or behaviors are, right? But beyond that, I do think if we can get each other's stories more deeply, particularly the bridging stories. These are the people I come from. These are the people I'm bringing into the room right now that you would never know I'm bringing into the room, because people don't talk about that, right? But that you're in relationship with them too, and you haven't even met them. That's, yeah. And the more we surface that, the more opportunity we have to actually appreciate the coherence of it. And the more coherent we become to each other, I just feel like the easier it's going to be to trust. So we really focus on doing a particular kind of storytelling and a particular kind of listening and offering, resonance back, that's framed in, ways that are not overly simple, but they're very accessible. And it gives people an opportunity to practice relating in a way they just would never, ever have had the opportunity to do. And it's making them more open and engaged and committed to working through difficult situations. And so I'm really excited, just about, even though that's one little lever of many levers in big systems, helping change makers not fail seems to me to be a really, really good idea
Yes.
at this moment. And it also keeps giving me a space to respond to that alarm that I continue to hear, but in ways that hopefully will really make a difference to protecting the institutions that are the only thing standing between us and some really, really horrible future.
I liked what you just said about the change maker not failing, because I mean, I think there's a particular kind of attention that needs to be given, the support, the understanding, but also, picking them up out of the bottom of that stream when they've already hit some rocks.
Exactly.
And not losing sight of their individuality and their human needs, and using them to create change as a product.
Yeah, you got it.
So I really like what you're saying. Really, really like what you say. And I mean, I do want to ask, where can people find you? Because I have a feeling a few people will be listening to this and just going, oh my God, I want more of him. Like, what is your...
Sure. Well, you can always find me, just my website, markfairfield.com. You'll always be able to find that. But I also would encourage people to go look at relationaluprising.org, which is the organization that I am now, doing a lot of kind of resource development and advising for. And it's led by my colleagues, Lucienne and Cedar. And
I'd love to speak with them, by the way.
I'll connect you, absolutely. So, but I would have a look at that, because I think you'll get a real flavor for the biggest possible vision for where we can take that work.
That sounds exciting.
Yeah.
So is there anything else you'd add at this point? Any final thought?
I feel like you've done a really great job of curating the me, that needed to come forward in this conversation, which I do appreciate. I was a little nervous going into it, which we spoke about just before we started. So I feel, like completed, which must be a good sign.
I guess so. So we'll leave it here then. And really, honestly, thank you very much. This has been very enjoyable and playful and pleasurable. So
yeah, for me too. Thank you for saying that. Thanks, Heather.